Welcome everyone to the special Focus Friday that we have today on community policing. This is defunding the police, really? And we've got quite a panel, and I'm Bill Russell with the Lake Norman Chamber of Commerce, and we're excited to have everyone join us virtually. I was speaking to our public policy chair, Jeff Tarte, recently and telling him with everything going on across this nation and the issue of defunding the police and what does that entail. That might be a great program to have. I will say on the onset, though, we have Chief Bence Hoyle on the line, that here in North Mecklenburg and Lake Norman, we have fantastic police departments that really integrate themselves into our community. Our National Night Out, which Bence, I'm not sure that we're going to be able to get that in. I don't know, maybe you could speak about that. But the National Nights Out that Cornelius and Davidson, Huntersville run, and getting the police involved with the community, and you see that interaction is just fantastic. But our police here in our Lake Norman communities, I've never felt like it's a me versus them mentality. So I respect what our law enforcement does here, and thank you, Chief, for what you do. I want to introduce our chair of our public policy, Jeff Tarte. He's going to be our moderator today. And Jeff, if you will introduce our speakers.
Thanks for having us all here. This morning, we have the pleasure of having three distinguished people with us. As background and full disclosure, I've actually had the opportunity to work with all three individuals professionally in different roles, from being mayor, being senator, or just involved in our local business community. First off, I'm going to introduce Eddie Caldwell. Eddie is the Executive Vice President and General Counsel for the Sheriff's Association. He represents the 100 sheriffs, 100 counties, unless there's some special district, Eddie, that I'm not aware of, but there's approximately 100 sheriffs and all their deputies that take care of us on a statewide basis, and it's a pleasure to have you here this morning, sir.
Thank you very much.
Next, we have Chief Bence Hoyle. Again, in full disclosure, when I was mayor of Cornelius, he was my police chief. He is a unique individual. He's currently the chief of this town of Huntersville. And again, we have, I guess, about 552 municipalities throughout the state. And he is the former past chair of the Police Association for the state of North Carolina as well. So he's got not only representation here around Lake Norman, but he has a good feel for municipal policing around the state. He also, when I said unique, there's not a lot of police chiefs that I know that can also computer program. And he has a very high technical IQ and very technically savvy that's helped us in a lot of things that we're doing around law enforcement, data analytics, the 911 system, the PSAP system, things like that. So Chief, it's always a pleasure to have you here this morning.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
And the last person I want to introduce is somebody who is a professional colleague. He's also somebody I consider a personal friend. I try to rub up against him and get some of his intellect to rub off on me. He's a Harvard undergrad, Georgetown Law School. He represents this area in the North Carolina House of Representatives. We're proud to have with us this morning Representative Chaz Beasley.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Well, we might as well go ahead and jump into this because I've got 3 pages of questions. So we should be we'll take a break for lunch and resume this afternoon at this page. But we've got about 50 minutes this morning. Just turn this into a conversation about some things going on. And then if there are a few questions, we have a couple of the mayors with us today. I know Mayor Woody Washam's with us from Cornelius, and I know Mayor Rusty Knox is with us today from Davidson as well. And they have big shoes and big responsibilities in keeping our community safe, as you all do. But maybe to start it off, given today's environment, and Chief, I'll put this to you first and then follow with Eddie. And then I'm going to frame it a little differently for you, Chaz, is what's the environment like to be in law enforcement today for the officers?
Well, I'll tell you, it's difficult, but they're pretty resolute. I mean, I really am so impressed with the way law enforcement are handling this crisis. I just can't say enough about the professionals we have working. It's very disheartening, I will tell you, when they hear their local communities talk about try to apply things that happen 2,000 miles away to each individual officer here. And we get some of that. But by and large, we've got a lot of support in this community, and always have had and always will have. I think the difficult part right now is what people don't understand is now is the time, for once and for all, we need to talk about properly funding police, not defunding police. We are in a recruiting crisis. People do not realize just how bad the recruiting situation is for police. We used to have 6 basic law enforcement training programs a year for every community college, and they had a waiting list of people to get on. Now we might get 2 classes a year graduated. A lot less people are getting into it. A lot of people are getting out of it. Our salaries are not competitive in the private sector, and it's really a crisis. And for the defunding thing to come out and the criticism to come out, which some of the criticism is justified, I'm not arguing that, but we really got to be thinking the other way. I had a conversation, to give you an example of people not understanding is I had a conversation, I think it was on one of these panels. They were saying, well, there's some legitimate reasons why we could defund, because the police shouldn't be doing, for example, involuntary commitment orders. That's been a problem for us for years. And we agree with that. We think that would be something you could take away. But the problem is there was never funding to begin with to do that. So we always just dump things on police. If society can't fix it, it becomes a police problem, right? So, but there's never any funding associated with that. It's just, we get assigned to it. It's like a lot of things, and we're not complaining, but there's no money allocated for involuntary commitments and a myriad of other things that we deal with that social services could deal with or somebody else. So it's what we're trying to do, I think, at mine and Eddie's level, and Eddie can chime in, but we're trying to change this conversation to highlight our issues. And if, the defunding conversation does that. That's why I don't mind the conversation, because we've got the opposite argument, and it gives us a chance to make it. So glad we're discussing it.
Gotcha. Eddie, what's the perspective you think from the sheriffs and the deputies?
I think they feel a lot of support from the community that they serve. You don't see that reflected in the evening newscast. A little over 2 weeks ago, a deputy in Henderson County was murdered in the line of duty. And last Friday, I had the privilege of attending the funeral. And as the funeral procession left the church to go to the cemetery, they took sort of a lengthy route through downtown Huntersville. And the streets were lined from start to finish with citizens of all demographics out in the street to show their support for law enforcement. So the support is there among the community at large, but that doesn't always get conveyed in the evening news. And I think we collectively as a community have to do a better job of encouraging folks to get out the good news about what's being done. We certainly need to address any problems. And we need to address any problem officers, but they are clearly the distinct, very small minority.
Appreciate it. Representative Beasley, from your perspective, share with us what you think at least the attitudes and maybe the conversations within and on the floor are around law enforcement right now.
Well, I think that there are 2 things that we have to talk about and we have to deal with, because they not only benefit the community, but they benefit the safety of law enforcement as well. And that is trust and accountability. The fact of the matter is, we all as elected officials, we all as public service, we all as government officials have a responsibility to the people who have put us in those positions of trust. And I think a lot of times there are people who feel as though when they have discussions about how to actually improve policing, or to have discussions about improving accountability, and thereby building that trust that you need in a community and in our communities, they feel as though they're oftentimes attacked or criticized, or that it's overly politicized. I'll give you a prime example. Just a few weeks ago, There was an attack on many of the members of the House about saying that they agreed to defund the police, many of whom, in fact, all of whom did not pledge to defund the police. And I think what that does is it sets up an antagonistic relationship. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people that think it's good politics to have an antagonistic relationship, and it's not. It's not good politics, and it's not beneficial to our law enforcement. It's not beneficial to our communities. We have to be willing to have the hard discussions about this, but we also have to be willing to talk about the fact that there are real things that need to change. And I think that sometimes there's a desire among many of the people who believe it's politically beneficial to set up an us versus them discussion and to reinforce it because it's going to get them votes in November. But ultimately, that makes the job of keeping our communities safer harder. And so we have to be very blunt about that, and blunt about the fact that there are many different ways to support any public official that includes holding them to their highest standard and to their higher selves. So I've been really frustrated by the fact that there has been a lot of people now that we're starting to get into election season that have made it their mission to create that negative dynamic, which I think does not serve anyone to actually advance the goal of better, safer communities.
Chaz, I appreciate the comments. Well, the three of you have hit on some things we're going to come back to, but I want to point out, I want to get a little bit into the scope of work issue. What is the appropriate scope? Is there opportunities to change, and should we be looking at changes of scope of work in the future that help us? Without question, for municipalities, with two of the mayors being a former mayor, for most towns, public safety is job one. It's police and fire are the top priorities typically for communities. So they're going to consume a large part of the budget. So I want to we're going to get into and defining defund police and what that means, what it really means. And we'll get into the budget aspect. And then two things, Chaz, you mentioned, accountability, how we talk about that from both law enforcement as well as criminals being held accountable. And then secondarily, talking about improving policies. But at a broad level, before we jump into the defund police as a literal topic, we are the chamber, and first and foremost, our membership and our constituency are the businesses. And I want to jump into a difficult topic a little bit. And I think we all support peaceful protesting. That's a constitutionally guaranteed right. But rioting, looting, and arson is clearly not. So with, again, the actions that are going on, what is means and manner in which you guys think we need to undertake the steps to keep our businesses safe? And Eddie, maybe I'm going to throw this in your lap first, because it'll be interesting to differentiate the sheriff's role, and then just generically law enforcement from your opinion would be appreciated.
Well, in a lot of the situations that we've seen recently in the media, the protests tend to originate in the downtown area of the various towns and cities. And so, of course, the police department has primary responsibility there. The sheriff has responsibility throughout the county to include the downtown areas and within the cities. And I think our sheriffs and our police chiefs work very cooperatively together. They all subscribe to mutual aid. And so prior to any planned protest, there's a lot of planning that goes into it by those agencies and their neighboring agencies to see how to manage it. Becomes more challenging when spontaneous protests pop up, and those have to be dealt with. And one of the things that we're seeing a lot of types of protests that are much different than what we've seen in recent decades. And so that's creating a real challenge for law enforcement. It's creating a challenge for our businesses.
But how are they different than we've seen in the past?
A lot of the violence of protest recently in the last few years has been much more so than prior times. The fact of folks coming in from out of town, you saw on the news recently where some of the protesters showed up with a U-Haul truck full of things to use to create turmoil and disrupt the community and destroy the community, paint, frozen water bottles, and things like that. And so that greatly changes the dynamic when folks, 98% of the folks that are out protesting intend to be respectful and not tear up property and so forth. But the small percent that do that really create a problem. And it's a challenge for law enforcement to separate out those that are intent on violence and damage from those that are just peacefully protesting.
Chief, any insights to this and how do we address it?
No, I'll just follow up with what Eddie said. There's legitimate protests out there, and the anarchists, I call them, I mean, they're criminals. There's no other way to say it, that they're trying to leverage the legitimate protest as an excuse to destroy. I mean, I really do believe there is a group out there nationally that's trying to, I don't want to use the word overthrow the government, but they're certainly wanting to drastically change everything. I mean, the same people some of the same people that's arguing defunding on the national level, for example, is arguing to close all prisons. And we hear that, and you think that's impossible. So I think Eddie's right. We're seeing, we've had two BLM protests here. Both were very peaceful. They were very respectful. They were saying things that police don't want to hear, but that's why they were protesting. But they were very respectful to us throughout the whole process. We spent 80% of our time trying to identify counter protesters and protect the protesters, right? So, and we did. We found people coming out open carry, trying to intimidate some of the protesters and things like that. So it's really very polarized, and I think keeping separation of those is very important. And I think one thing we have to do is whether, both for us to have peace and for us to get the protesters' message out, which needs to be out, we have to come together and say the violence has to be stopped. And this means, means pepper spray, this means rubber bullets, this means all the things that people don't want to talk about. We have to take an aggressive approach toward the violence so that the real message can get out and we have peace about it. It's very hard for us to have a conversation about Kenosha, Wisconsin, and what happened there, and also have a conversation about police when you got violence going on. You cannot spread either message when the violence is going on, because that's all that people's worried about. So I think we have to really condemn the violence, really fight the violence, and get back to peaceful protest and change within police departments. That's where I'm at.
Representative, is there discussions, or are you aware of conversations in various committees in the past or going forward that's going to try to address the violence component of the protests?
Well, I know that we actually have two different task forces on the state level, one by the governor, one by the speaker, that are going to be talking about this issue. They've already met to discuss these issues to try to create positive change on these issues. I do want to make sure that we talk about one thing, because I think it's important to keep things in context, especially when you look at where we've been as a country and where we're headed. Many times we talk about Martin Luther King, we quote Martin Luther King, but I think it's important to remember why Martin Luther King was in Tennessee on the day that he was shot and killed. He was there because he was trying to put together a peaceful protest in Memphis to protect sanitation workers. And what happened with those sanitation workers is that they were not allowed to take any kind of cover when it rained. And so they were sitting in the back of their trash truck, and two of them were crushed and killed when one of the levers accidentally went off. And so they decided to protest to make sure that they could at least go in out of the rain when that was happening. And when he was in Memphis, there was a protest that he put together, and there were some people that came in, jumped into the protest, and started being violent. And we know that Martin Luther King's major strategy of desegregation and social change was nonviolence. And so he decided to come back and stick around to try to create a nonviolent march. And what he said in his final speech on this earth, he said that the most fundamental of American rights is the right to protest for rights. And I think we have to keep that in mind. You know, when people are talking about things that you agree with and you like, then usually you're rah-rah for the protest. When people are saying things that you don't like, then usually what happens is that people find ways to criticize it. This year, we've really had two major strings of protest. One has been around police accountability, but one has also been around the pandemic. And I saw images of people literally getting into police officers' faces with no masks on to antagonize them. And so I think that we have to be, clearly critical of people being disrespectful and being violent in every single context, while also understanding that people are usually protesting because there's something that they believe is unheard that needs to be heard. So my philosophy is very simple. I think that we have to be very deliberate about how we talk about these types of issues, understanding that oftentimes the key hallmark of protest is making people pay attention to things that they may not necessarily be paying enough attention to.
Chaz, I'm going to keep it with you for a second, and we'll start down the pathway of the defund police. And I think other than a very, very microcosm of kind of the radical extremes of the political ideology actually want police and law enforcement shut down. It's not what I think most people define it as. We look at it as a shift and a reallocation of resources, maybe is the simplest way to find it. What are the conversations you guys are having? Because you fund troopers, the state troopers, the highway patrol. You fund, there's a component for the National Guard. You guys are obviously representing municipalities. What's the conversations around actually the shifting of resources? And that's going to be a very key comment or a question. We'll come back to the other two gentlemen.
Well, I think that when it comes to government, you always want to make sure that you're doing everything that the government is providing effectively and efficiently. I think that it's also important to remember that when you're talking about a state as large as ours, 10.5 million people, if the last number I heard was that there are about 18,000 different law enforcement entities nationwide. So that's 18,000 ways of doing things, 18,000 ways of changing things, changing lives for the better or for the worse. I think we have to keep in mind that when we're making decisions, we want to make sure that every agency, including our public safety entities, have what they need to be effective, and that they're using it in the most effective way. But we also have to remember that our resources are scarce. Now, I've said, and many of my colleagues in the House have said, that they do not support defunding the police. I think that, who hear that in the police or making it so that police have no money whatsoever. Really what it comes down to is this: we have to have these kinds of conversations around everything that government does to make sure that everything that the government is doing is being done in the best way possible. And so I do think that's a conversation worth having, but I do want to be abundantly clear. I have not heard one of my colleagues advocate for defunding or abolishing police departments across North Carolina.
All right, Chief Hoyle. We've said in budget meetings, this to me strikes a little bit as a budget issue. And what's your insights and what would you share with everyone listening in? That allocation, as you said, we got shortages in training, shortages in salary and stuff. And yet you look at Baltimore, who took multiple $1 million out of the police budget and shifted it into a trauma center, put it into daycare. There are things that are needed in the community, but it seems to be they're targeting the police departments to be the source of that funding. What's your thoughts and insights to help us?
Yeah, well, keep in mind that we're all team players. I can tell you, in the past, when times were really tough on cities, I've had to lay off 2 officers so that we could hire people in our street department. I've actually had to do that. We understand that. What we're talking about here is, for years, the police and sheriffs have been taking on responsibilities that are very, very difficult to solve. I use the example of involuntary commitments, but you can go into everything from property disputes to, all that civil. There's so many civil related things that are not related to police that can be done. And we do it because we have the ability to keep the peace in those processes. And we have the ability to protect doctors and nurses. That's why we got into the involuntary commitment. We're not mental health experts, but no money was ever allocated for that. So you can't really have a conversation about reallocating money that was never allocated to begin with. I think what we have to realize, though, is that in this recruiting situation that we're in, one of the things that we've tried to do over the years, and it's the purpose of the North Carolina Chiefs Association that I was president of, and the Sheriff's Association that Eddie's associated with, is our whole goal is to create a truly professional environment, so that officers are licensed, they're certified, they're decertified when they're found to do things wrong, just like a doctor or a lawyer is disbarred or loses their medical license. And we really strive to do that. But what you've got to realize is that all of a sudden our recruiting pool has become very, very limited. Now, fortunately, we're getting a lot of very professional young millennials and the next generation, whatever we're going to call them, I can't remember. But they're really awesome professionals. But also in that is a very, very limited pool. When you take agencies that are not as fortunate as me to be able to pay, above average wages for the state, we're still having a difficult time recruiting. And the people coming into the system, we're not as much in control as the people we're bringing in anymore. That's what my big worry is, that we have people that's not properly vetted, because the 911 calls still come in, right? We still have to have warm bodies to answer these calls. And I'm afraid that we're not able to vet like we formerly did in the past. We have to excuse this kind of behavior, or we have to excuse this conviction because we really are desperate to bring people in. So I really think now we have to center this discussion on hiring absolute professionals that are willing to deal with these complex problems and understand what de-escalation is and execute de-escalation properly. And it's very difficult when you have people that are coming in because they think blue lights are cool. It's just a very difficult situation, and we got to think through how we're funding police specifically for personnel. I'm not worried about operational costs. Operational costs is 15% of my budget. I'm worried about people.
Sure, it's labor costs.
Yeah.
Eddie, I'm going to pivot a little bit on what Chief Hoyle mentioned, and it's the concept of vetting, and I'm going to take it down a pathway because it's a big topic, the whole vetting and what is the proper skill set resources to bring into law enforcement. But I'm going to pivot a little bit and go around, okay, how do we identify and deal with the bad apples? Because we recognize 99% of the people in law enforcement are incredible people. They're the first ones to run into trouble to protect us, literally to take a bullet. But we've got the people like in the George Floyd incident and some of these, and we continue to see stuff. How do we identify the bad apples, and what is the process to get them out of the system? And then the last piece of this, and I apologize for being so long, how do we keep them out?
Well, the keeping out is a lot easier than the getting out. And the key is, and Chief Hoyle touched on this, not hiring them in the first place. And he touched on the issue of salaries. And I talked to a sheriff just this week who had a detention officer who left to go take a job as a clerk at the Dollar General because they could make as much money as they could make working in the jail. And so a lot of agencies across the state have entry-level salaries in the high 20,000s or the low 30,000s that won't compete with even fast food workers in some restaurants. And so in order to get the cream of the crop into law enforcement, we've got to pay a fair salary and a living wage for those folks so that we can attract the best and the brightest and keep them because that's what we need to increase the professionalism. In terms of getting them out, one of the problems we currently have, and let me say before I go into that, The Chiefs Association has worked very diligently on recommended changes in law enforcement, and they put out a report. The Sheriff's Association, we've had a committee of 13 sheriffs meeting about every 2 weeks for the last couple of months. And we'll have a very detailed report coming out in the middle of October with specific changes recommended in our criminal justice system that we believe will greatly increase the professionalism and help us keep the bad officers out and get them out when they slip in. One of the things that happens all too often currently in our state and across the country is that an officer gets in trouble in one agency, and instead of getting indicted, which sometimes would be appropriate, they're allowed to resign, and then they, a few months later, show up in a little smaller agency. And then they get in trouble there eventually, and then they wind up in a little smaller agency. That concept is referred to as gypsy cops. And one of the proposals that the Sheriff's Association will be coming forward with will specifically address that and see how we can tighten up that situation so that when an officer has a problem, we have 100 sheriff's offices in the state, and I think it's 400 and some police departments across the state. When an officer does something they shouldn't do and they should lose their job in one of those, then we can do a better job of making sure they don't pop up somewhere else. But a big issue that we fortunately have not had to deal with in this state are labor unions. And North Carolina is the second to the lowest behind South Carolina unionized state in the country. A number of years ago, there was federal legislation that proposed nationwide collective bargaining for law enforcement. And when you get that, and that's where you see a lot of these problems are in big cities around the country. You don't see them in the rural areas or the small towns as much, but a lot of these problems are in the big cities where they have labor unions, and it's just about impossible to get a bad officer removed from the force. And so we're fortunate in that regard. That's something that we're counting on Representative Beasley and all his colleagues in the General Assembly to help us keep the ability of law enforcement agency heads, whether it's sheriffs or police chiefs or the colonel of the highway patrol or whomever, to be able to get rid of those officers that are not living up to the standards that we all would like for them to live up to.
Chief, anything you would add there? And then secondarily, that next wave is how do we hold law enforcement officers accountable? What's your thoughts on that?
Well,
that's a question that's constantly asked by the public.
right. Well, let me say this. First of all, this was a system failure. So failure, in my opinion, when we talk about George Floyd. So it's my understanding, I can't confirm this, maybe one of you can, but my understanding is he had double-digit numbers of use of force complaints against him. Double-digit numbers. I heard 16, I heard 12. I don't know what that number is, but certainly he had a number of use of force complaints against him. We've had early warning systems in place at our agencies, both agencies I've worked for. I don't know, I assume it's across the state. If you're accredited, you've got an early warning system that requires you, even if an officer is found sustained, if, in other words, not sustained, if he was found to be acting appropriately, and let's say 6 use of force complaints, there is still a review of his actions at the end of a certain period where he has to justify why he has 6 complaints and nobody else has had any. It's the fact that you've had 6, even if they're justified, there's some underlying things that get hidden in there. Is somebody just covering for him, or has he got his story straight to keep himself out of trouble, and that's why they're not sustained? So we have to look at systemic failures, not just the individual officers about, and I think Eddie hit on it perfectly, is some of the contracts that unionized agencies have make it very difficult to discipline. I know one agency, I know a lot of chiefs across the country, and I know one agency that one third of their officers are on light duty, not because they're sick, because they're giglio impaired. Now, if you're familiar with that term, giglio impaired means that if you've done something that's a distrust issue, it has to be reported to the defense in a case, right? So if you've cheated on a test, or you stole something, or you've done something that could bring your integrity into question, it has to be disclosed to every defense attorney on every arrest you have. It's called giglio impaired. It's a case. Well, I know an agency that the chief tells me he's got 1/3 of his people gigglo impaired, but he can't fire them because of the contracts they're under. So we've got to be smarter as a system about putting rules in place about no chokeholds. We've had no chokeholds for 10 years. We've had policies in place for 10 years, longer than 10 years, that says if you see an officer assaulting somebody and using excessive force, your duty is to aggressively stop that officer, including arresting him and subduing him, to keep excessive use of force from happening. We've had those policies for years. And my understanding is after George Floyd, they've decided to implement those policies. That has been a national best practice for years. So I don't know whether it's required accreditation or state level accreditation. I don't know what it is, but we've got to do better at being police chiefs and sheriffs about holding people responsible and communicating what those expectations are.
So the certifications, are those things, and are these kinds of issues addressed within CALEA?
Not certifications necessarily. That's done at the state level. And I can tell you, our state are very strict on those things. We will get some disciplinary action that we feel like is just normal, and we may get a call from the state say, hey, we're going to look into this one, but I don't think certifications has anything to do with CALEA other than, officers have to be certified.
Right. So question being, and just for the general public and businesses to understand, what percentage of police officers, and I'm going to ask you the same thing, Eddie, and then I'm going to come back a different question around this for you, Chaz. What percentage do you think of officers actually have gone through force-on-force training, and then maybe ask you to define that, explain it, and then what percentage of those have taken the other side and actually have been trained in de-escalation techniques?
Were you speaking to the chief or to me?
I would like you to both address it if you would.
All right. I'll say this, 100% of our officers have been to both at some point in time. Now, I don't think we've done enough de-escalation training at this point. I think we've done some experimental things, and there's a lot of money going around from consultants about de-escalation training. And Charlotte just built a de-escalation center, a facility to focus on de-escalation, and the state is coming out with some de-escalation training, and we're going to really hold off on just jumping on every consultant's sales pitch at this point until we get some good guidance from places like Sheriff's Association, Chief Association. But every certified officer has to go through, active shooter, different things like that. We certainly could do better on some of the more intricate and advanced techniques and stuff like that. But all of us have had a taste of that.
Interesting. Eddie, on the sheriff's side?
One of the things that many folks are not aware of outside of the law enforcement community is that the Standards Division annual requirement for law enforcement officers, both police officers and deputy sheriffs, is 24 hours of in-service training every year. And for lawyers, it's only 12 hours a year. So we require law enforcement officers to do twice as much in-service training every year as required of our attorneys. Part of that is firearms training every year. And part of that, of course, is the practical shooting at the target and qualifying. But a very important part of it is a review of the state law on use of force and the agency policy on use of force. And that must be done with every officer in the state every year. And it's been that way for decades. And so that's very important. A number of years ago, we added a shoot, don't shoot practical skills requirement to the annual training. And so a lot of training is focused on that, and officers are fully trained on what they can and can't do under the law. When you talk about de-escalation, a lot of that comes, and I agree with the chief, seems like everybody and their brother is trying to offer a de-escalation class. One of the problems with that is de-escalation is not defined. And so what that means to one person might mean something different to someone else. A lot of what it means is just treating all citizens with respect and dignity and honor to the extent that they will allow you to do that. And as long as the citizen the officer is interacting with will allow the officer to treat them that way and comply with their lawful directions, then the situation will it will not ever escalate. So there will be no need to de-escalate the situation. But unfortunately, in some circumstances, the citizen that the officer is encountering will not allow the officer to do that, and that will not solve the problem. And so the situation has to escalate so that the officer can take whatever precautions are necessary or actions are necessary to protect the victim, to investigate the crime, or whatever the call for service might be.
Jeff, just one quick follow-up on that, and I agree with that 100%. If you look at, I had somebody suggest one day that if we could just figure out a way to de-escalate some of these active shooter scenarios. I mean, you don't de-escalate active shooter scenarios. It's a totally different thing. And I think, you know, the recent one we had in Indiana where the guy came out of the house with a knife and chased the officer down the street. When he caught him, he turned and shot the guy. That is not a de-escalation scenario. That's a survival scenario. And I think we have to be very careful to expect police to de-escalate everything.
So just briefly for us is what is a de-escalation situation? How would you define it or explain it?
Well, I would define it as a situation where you have a group of people or a domestic situation to where you're not hateful, you're not treating people bad. I mean, really, you see officers come in. I call it the mirrored sunglasses kind of look. You know, where you're the man when you get there, and everybody better behave. That, you know, it's about community policing and treating people with dignity and respect. That's what it is, and that's what we preach. You're always kind. You're always, you know, understanding of their situation and things like that. But you're not going to de-escalate every situation. And we have to, you know, the worst thing we can do is get into a situation where an officer feels like his obligation is to de-escalate everything. He has to recognize when he has a threat against him. And, you know, we've got to protect them, and we've got to let them know it's okay to protect yourself.
Sure.
And it's very difficult because we've been dealing this for years. We say all the time that our jobs are 95% boredom and 5% sheer terror. And we don't know when that sheer terror happens. And we've got to make sure that we understand de-escalation is a thing that we need to take the opportunity to do when the situation presents itself, but it cannot be expected in all situations.
Sure. Representative Beasley, what do you see? Because it's kind of, and I'm going to go kind of down the scope of work stuff a little bit here. What's being considered, or do you think should be considered from a legislative perspective on scope of work for law enforcement and training and those things that we need to either, for lack of a better term, mandate, or at least the dialogue become very serious?
Well, one of the pieces of legislation that I actually proposed was one of the things that Eddie actually brought up, which is the idea that if someone is fired for cause in one jurisdiction, we should have a statewide database so that every police officer or every hiring department of every police department or sheriff's department will be able to tell that and know that. Now, does that mean that it needs to be, you know, out there in the world? Not necessarily, but it does mean that when people are making hiring decisions, they should know if someone was fired for breaking the law in another jurisdiction. I think that our state can be on the forefront of that. I also think another thing that's very important is to make sure that officers are comfortable bringing up concerns in their own departments and not concerned about being fired if they bring up a concern within their own department. I have that protection in my private life as an employee. How much more so should our law enforcement officers have that right, given the high stakes that they're involved in, and given the fact that when things go wrong, they can go very, very wrong, and that when mistakes are made, people's lives hang in the balance, people in the community and law enforcement officers alike. So I do think that that in particular is two things that we can do. I'm very happy that more and more people are starting to talk about this issue and try to figure out changes. A lot of times what we see is that there are plenty of ideas that are already out there, have already been discussed, researched, and vetted, but that we in the legislature are behind the curve a little bit. And I think that what we have to do is we have to make sure we're building those relationships with the community, as well as with people within law enforcement, so that we can make those changes in a way that doesn't allow them to be easily politicized and turned into things where people are actually trying to do what's best for the community and get unnecessary criticism for it.
Kind of on the defund thing before we shift away, Chaz. I don't know if you're familiar with the comments, what transpired in Asheville with the budget. They actually reallocated some of the budget to non-law enforcement things. And Senator Edwards came out with a statement that he would file a bill that for any municipality that defunds the police, and I mean takes budget allocations away, he would take budget allocations away in like share from those cities, from the state. How do you react and what's your thoughts around that?
Well, I think that what I was always taught to believe is that small government conservatism means make decisions that are best for them. Sound like a very small government bill, quite frankly. I think that we have to, all of these municipalities, all of these police forces, everybody is making decisions about very limited resources. And to me, what that sounds like is that it's going to be the state determining what or why or what the motivations were for any particular budget writer and any particular planning department of any particular municipality had in mind when they made a particular budget allocation. It may very well be that in a circumstance, the reason that the amount of money going to a police department is going down is because the amount of money coming into the city is going down, or there was some sort of de-annexation. There's so many different things that could go into why that decision is made. I believe in the same way, and I said this to many of the sheriffs. I called many of the sheriffs throughout my time in the General Assembly and asked them when there were bills that popped up relating to sheriff's departments, and asked them, what do you think? And sometimes I was surprised by the answers that they gave me. Similarly, I think we have to be willing to understand that a lot of these people live in their own communities and have a vested interest in their own communities being safe too, and that we in Raleigh don't have all the answers. And sometimes we need to be a little bit more understanding, and understanding that, hey, if somebody's making a decision about a particular community, then they need to trust it. When it comes to Asheville specifically, I will say from a personal perspective, up until a few months ago when my great-grandmother passed away, I had 5 generations of my family living in Asheville. Guarantee you that they are just as vested in the success and safety of Asheville as anybody else. I think we need to make sure that we're not creating big government type of solutions in Raleigh when it comes to these types of issues, coming from people that claim to be small government conservatives. I think that's a real problem.
I gotcha. Well, one last line of questions that I wanted to do, and then I know we're kind of getting close on time. I was going to see if either of the mayors had something they wanted to ask or direct in a second, and then we'll give each of you guys a chance to any closing comments. But we're in the time of COVID right now, and we have different directives relative to wearing masks, not wearing masks, gathering limits. Eddie, what's your thoughts for the sheriffs and trying to enforce this? Is that and I'm not trying to put you guys on a spot with the governor or mayors, but is that a good use of time? How do we effectively do that, should do that? What's your thoughts?
Well, it's a challenging enforcement issue, partly because the restrictions and the requirements have so many exceptions to them that it's virtually impossible for an officer on the scene to determine if someone qualifies for one of the exceptions or not. I think law enforcement has done a great job, both our sheriffs and their personnel and our police departments and their personnel and the state agencies, in focusing on compliance versus in making charges and things like that. But when you've got as diverse a communities as we have in terms of where people are gathered and what they're doing, it's a real challenge. And I know everyone has been talking about the importance of complying with these guidelines so we can eradicate the virus if at all possible. But it's a real challenge for officers out on the street. And it's something that's our citizenry are very opinionated about. Some are very much for these protocols and some are very much against it. And it's officers that are out on the front lines.
Chief Hoyle, any additional insights relative to COVID enforcement?
Well, I'll just get back to it makes my point. You know, we talked about involuntary commitments and all of a sudden now we're enforcing something totally new that, you know, we didn't have 6 months ago. And honestly, I'm just going to give you my honest opinion about it is we've got something that we, you know, when you try to figure out whether a law is valid or not, you look at whether it's overly broad or vague. This is all of the above. And we are encouraging people to wear masks, and we certainly are dealing with some of the requirements that you have to close businesses and group settings and stuff like that. But we are not going to be the Gestapo of the mask police. So we haven't been from the beginning, and it's just impossible to, you know, we're not going to stop people on the street and tell them they have to wear a mask or extricate somebody from a place because they don't have a mask. It's just, you know, it's a very difficult situation. I for one, will be glad when this is over. I think it has so polarized our communities that, you know, we're going to domestic disputes over COVID. You know, it's just, and I understand why. It's everybody's stressed out about it. So I don't really have a comment around the COVID thing. I just, you know, it's just, it's the rule. I think, what's the latest resolution that's come out? I think it's 200 and I think I quit counting at 220.
The executive orders as governor.
Different rules, and every time it gets more muddy because special interests get one thing, and you know, the louder a special interest group is, whether it be the gyms or the bar owners, there's an exception carved out for the political volume, right? And that's just something police don't do very well with. You know, it
couldn't have to.
It's got to be clear, and it's got to be non-confusing so that we can enforce it. And people don't think about the enforcement side when they come up with these political solutions. So that's kind of where I'm at with it. Not a big fan.
Yeah, I hear you. Bill, if you would. Mayor Knox, you had a question?
I didn't have a question. I wanted to comment on what Bence just said. You know, when we implemented our mask requirements and let the businesses decide where they were going to go, we wanted to make sure to what the chief said, that our police have real life crimes to investigate and fight. They don't need to be enforcing mask regulations, and you know, it's worked pretty well. I mean, you know, our merchants almost across the board said mask required, and if you didn't wear a mask, you didn't come in. And we fortunately have not had anyone to push back to the point where a store owner would end up having to call the police to have someone move from a store. But I think quickly, let me talk about the defunding dialogue. You know, when I took office 3 years ago, we were 7 officers short of the old state public adequate public facilities ordinance of having enough officers to cover our populace. And we made a pledge to make sure that we hired those officers, and we have. We have a full staff in Davidson now. We've upgraded equipment. I got some criticism during the last budget round because every year the police budget goes up. But what people don't realize is that budget is not about bullets. I think that, you know, the criticism that I got for that was, and it's not. I mean, if you look at crisis mitigation training and de-escalation training and racial sensitivity training, in and of themselves, CALIA certification, the requirements that are required of our department have a monetary value that we spend. I mean, you know, the classes that our officers go to are not free. They are you know, I know for de-escalation, I had 2 officers that were in Wilmington several weeks ago for training. So it's not like it's out their back door at Central Piedmont or something. They've got to travel for these things too. So the lion's share of the budget has nothing to do with buying bullets and equipment. And I think people don't realize that if you're going to have professional standards that are going to be followed for the protection of not only our community, but for the protection of our officers as well, because I honestly, I admire the hell out of a police officer. I mean, you got the only job in the world where you put a Kevlar vest on in the morning, you kiss your wife goodbye, and you may not come home at night. And that, you know, other than an active duty military person, nobody else has that job. So it's you know, we are at a very divisive time in our country right now, and everybody wants to point a finger here and point a finger there. But I feel fortunate in Davidson that I've got a police department that is very responsive, very engaged, and very well liked by the 14,000 people that live in this town. They are interactive with kids, with homeowners associations, with baseball teams and basketball teams and things like that. So it's, you know, we're fortunate here, but the defunding thing has never been a dialogue that we've had at Davidson.
I gotcha. Mayor Washam, I know you're still on, was there. I wanted to give you an opportunity if you had a comment or a question.
Yeah, only thing I'll say very quickly is, you know, I think it's important. I know when this really began with the George Floyd incident, and we began having talks of protest and so forth in our town, I just thought it was important for our agency to sort of take it down to the bones and re-examine everything we were doing and make sure we were getting it right. We had just gone through a very public but very extensive study, if you will, conducted by national entities that gave us some pretty good reports, but made some suggestions for some tweakings. So my point to our chief was, let's just make sure we aren't being reluctant or naive about the way we're doing things, that we continue to go through self-examinations to make sure we got it right. We've continued to get it right. We talk a lot about community policing. I don't know that I've heard that word today. I think we all think we do that, but what does that mean? And how clearly does our public understand what that means? So those kind of things, I think, have made it work for us. We did tweak some things. We did change some things that weren't too major, but I think they made a difference. And I hope we can continually do that. There's always a better way to do things as it relates to really everything in life. So my hope is that as it relates to policing, I think if we do that and are reasonable about it, that you know, there really hadn't been much conversation in my town except support for our guys in blue, and really our firefighters is the entirety of our public safety. So, you know, I hope they'll continue to examine themselves and get it right. And I think as long as they do that, we'll be fine. There's no plans in my community to talk about cutting budget. Matter of fact, we increased it. I continued about police officers deciding that it's too dangerous. We have had that happen. I don't want that to catch on and become a bigger issue. It is an issue, but I don't want it to grow and become bigger. So a lot of concern about it, but it's important to get it right.
Thanks, Mayor. Appreciate it. Well, Representative Beasley, I'll give you the floor next. Any last thoughts you want to leave us with?
So I do think, number one, we have to remember that the stakes in this are very, very high. There are a lot of people that very much want to make sure that they feel safe in their own communities, and that's a task that we have delegated to law enforcement. But that in a lot of places the trust is not there, and that trust is not going to get better if people see it as a political benefit to try to make it an antagonistic relationship. I think one thing that we do have to be very open and honest about and very direct about is that when it comes to communities of color, the Black community, the Latinx community, that a lot of times they are seen as though when they bring up good faith concerns that somehow they're not supportive of safe communities. And we have to start knocking down that narrative and really pulling that out root and branch. We have to be very, very direct about it and very open about it, because I do think there are a lot of people that are starting to see as making it, between communities enforcement is good politics, and they want to try and do as much as they can to drive a wedge there. And I think that we have to be willing to step up and make sure that that does not happen, and that we stop that in its tracks. I think that a big part of that responsibility for that is not only on the communities that are being policed, but also on law enforcement to make sure that they are remaining present and that they are pushing back against any of these narratives that try to make it quite frankly, what I've seen a lot of times on social media, a Black versus blue issue. That dynamic in and of itself is problematic, and it makes communities less safe. And we have to be very willing to stop that in its tracks and push back against it. So I didn't want us to hop off of here without being direct about that, explaining why people who are trying to create that dynamic are actually making communities less safe, and making sure that we know that it is upon every single one of us to stop that dynamic from being built in, because it will make everybody, whether they be people in the community or law enforcement, less safe if that narrative continues to be pushed and continue in home.
Spectacular comment. I really appreciate you sharing that, Chaz. Mr. Caldwell.
I think as we go forward to address these issues, it's important that our legislative leaders and other state leaders lean heavily on the law enforcement community to identify areas where change and improvement is needed. Many of the problems that we hear about on the nightly news are in other states and are situations that we just don't deal with in this state because we're already doing a good job. When you look at the use of force statistics and the investigations that follow those, you'll find that in North Carolina, we're doing an excellent job. And certainly the Sheriff's Association and the Chiefs Association both are going to be coming forward with proposals on changes that we believe are necessary. But we're also going to talk about those things that we're doing an excellent job of in North Carolina, so we don't get painted by the national brush. And then we'll talk about those things that we know can improve, and some things that we're not doing at all that we need to start doing. And we hope that we'll get legislative support for that, support from the governor, support from the business community, local government elected officials. What we hope does not happen is that our elected leaders listen to these out-of-state think tanks and advocacy groups, almost all of whom have an agenda, and frequently talk about things that are not relevant to the existing situation in North Carolina. Let's identify our issues and work collectively together to solve the issues that we have in our state.
That's great. Appreciate the comments. We definitely need to take care of home first. Chief Hoyle? Nope, we lost you there. You're muted, Bence.
Hey, is that better?
Much better.
All right. Yeah, I talk better when I'm not muted. So, yeah, I just want to get back, just say, kind of to what Mayor Knox said and Mayor Washam is, we really do appreciate at the local level the amount of support that we're getting. I'll give you a perfect example. Asheville, we talked about Asheville and what's going on up there, which, by the way, I support what's happening up there because I'm getting some awesome applicants down here. But one of the applicants came down and saw she came down for an interview, and she saw all the signs out in front of the police department where it says, "We love you" and "God bless you." And, we got somebody putting up signs that's just, they're all over the place. And I don't know who it is, but she took pictures and texted it back to her friends in Asheville and said, can you believe this is happening? And, first of all, I was thinking, okay, this is going to work good for recruiting. You can't beat that kind of marketing. But I also thought, how cool is it to be here? And I want every citizen in all three towns that see this to tell you how much we appreciate the outpouring of support we've had. Too much food, too many cookies, I'm telling you, and donuts. You gotta have donuts. But we really do appreciate just the words. We appreciate all the words and the encouragement. We're getting ready to probably kick off something similar to Top Deck down here. The Top Deck is a nonprofit we started when we were in Cornelius, and it was due to a tragedy. An officer was shot. That's what started this nonprofit. And people's come forward and want to do the same thing here just because of everything that's going on nationally. And so there's going to be good, positive things come out of this. And I want the citizens know that we hear every single one of those voices that's out there supporting us, and we appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, guys, you know, I'm proud of our chamber because we haven't shied away from the difficult subjects just because they're difficult. These are conversations that we need to carry on, not just on an ad hoc basis, but they need to become part of our regular dialogue on a daily basis to overcome this. We are very fortunate to live in the community and the environment we do around Lake Norman. It is unbelievable place to be and live and raise family and go to work every day. But, you know, I am fortunate and blessed to know every single one of you on this call have had the opportunity to work beside every single one of you on very critical and important topics. And I will tell everybody that's listening and gets a chance to listen, we are truly, truly blessed to have people in the leadership roles that you all serve in and how you do take care of and care about our communities. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure to have you on today. Thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedules. Bill, back to you.
Thank you, Jeff. And you kind of talked about some of the things I was going to wrap up with. We went kind of long today, but this was a great subject and one that needed to be discussed. And the Chamber of Commerce, we have right at 850 members, and Chief Hoyle, Mayor Knox, Mayor Washam, on behalf of all of our businesses and our employees, thank you. So very often the leadership at the top is making decisions that allows our police to move forward and keep us safe, keep our families safe, keep our businesses safe. So thank you very much for your support of our local law enforcement, and thank you for our law enforcement for the job that you're doing. As we mentioned, this program is made possible by the generous support of Novant Health Huntersville Medical Center. We want to thank Mike Riley and Novant for sponsoring this program. We have a lot of great programs. We've got another wonderful program coming up next month. Jeff's already got Treasurer Caldwell, who's going to be speaking at the next Focus Friday, on the third Friday, but a lot of wonderful programs. Just go to our Chamber of Commerce website at lakenormanchamber.org. I want to thank everybody for being on the call, and I hope everybody has a great day at the lake.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.